The rain stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles, but Lila didn't flinch. She stood on the corner of 8th Avenue, her cardboard sign sagging under the weight of the downpour. Homeless. Hungry. Help. The words blurred as water dripped from her auburn hair, matting it against her dirt-streaked cheeks. At 22, Lila had learned to ignore the pitying glances of passers-by, their hurried steps splashing her worn sneakers. But tonight, something was different. A sleek black car idled across the street, its tinted windows hiding the eyes she could feel watching her. Eleanor Grayson, 35, sat inside that car, her manicured fingers tapping against the leather armrest. From her vantage point, the city was a chessboard, and she was a queen who'd mastered every move except one. Her wealth, her penthouse overlooking Central Park, her empire of boutique galleries. They meant nothing without the one thing she couldn't buy, a child. Years of failed treatments, broken relationships, and sleepless nights had led her here, to this desperate, impossible idea. She'd heard whispers of surrogacy agencies bending rules for the right price, but Eleanor wanted no middleman. She wanted control. Her gaze locked on Lila, the girl who seemed to embody everything she wasn't. Raw, untamed, surviving on scraps of hope. Lila felt the car's presence like a pulse. She'd seen enough of New York's elite to know they didn't linger in places like this unless they wanted something. When the window rolled down, revealing a woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes like polished jade, Lila's stomach twisted. "You," the woman said, her voice smooth but commanding. "Get in. We need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and danger. Lila's instincts screamed to run. Strangers with nice cars didn't offer salvation without a cost. But the cold bit deeper, and her empty stomach growled. She glanced at the sign in her hands, then back at the woman. One step forward and her life could change. Or end. She didn't know which scared her more. The car door opened, and Lila slid into the warmth of the leather interior, her damp clothes leaving smudges on the pristine seat. Eleanor didn't seem to notice. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "I have a proposition, one that could change your life." Lila's eyes narrowed. She'd heard lines like this before. Men in bars, women with fake smiles, all promising futures that never came. But Eleanor's gaze held something different, a hunger that mirrored Lila's own, though for what, she couldn't guess. "I'm not a hooker," Lila said, her voice rough, testing the waters. Eleanor's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I don't want your body. Not like that." She leaned forward, her perfume, something expensive, like jasmine and ambition, filling the space. "I want you to have my child." Lila froze. The words didn't compute, not at first. She'd been offered money for a lot of things. Her time, her pride, her silence. But never this. "You're crazy," she said, reaching for the door handle. Eleanor's hand shot out, not touching her but close enough to make Lila pause. "Hear me out," Eleanor said. "I'll pay you. Enough to get you off the streets. A new life. A real one." The numbers Eleanor offered were staggering. 50,000 up front. Another 100,000 when the baby was born. A contract, clean and legal, no strings attached. Lila's mind raced. She could see it. A tiny apartment, a bed that wasn't a shelter cot, food that didn't come from a dumpster. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, her composure slipping for the first time. "Because you're nobody," she said, then winced at her own bluntness. "I mean, you're not tied to anyone. No family, no obligations." I checked. Lila's jaw tightened. She didn't ask how Eleanor knew. The rich always had ways of digging up your secrets. "And because," Eleanor continued, softer now, "you look like you're fighting for something. I need someone who fights." Lila's laugh was bitter. "Fighting? I'm surviving. There's a difference." But her mind was already spinning, weighing the risks. A baby. 9 months. Her body, her choice, but not really. She'd be giving up a piece of herself, something she couldn't take back. And yet, the alternative was another night in the rain. another day begging for scraps. She looked at Eleanor, at the woman's polished exterior and the cracks beneath it, cracks that spoke of loss, of yearning. Lila knew that look. She saw it in the mirror every day. "Give me the contract," Lila said finally, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. Eleanor's eyes lit up, a spark of victory, but Lila wasn't done. "And don't think you own me. This is business." Eleanor nodded, a flicker of respect in her gaze. "Business," she agreed. The car pulled away from the curb, slicing through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan. Two women, worlds apart, bound by a deal that would test the limits of trust, love, and sacrifice. Lila stared out the window, her reflection a ghost in the glass. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment her life would split in two, before the deal and after. The penthouse smelled of lavender and money. Lila stood in the center of Eleanor's living room, her sneakers leaving faint dirt marks on the polished hardwood. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering Manhattan skyline, a world so far from the shelters and alleys Lila knew that it felt like stepping onto another planet. She clutched her backpack, the only thing anchoring her to herself, as Eleanor handed her a thick stack of papers. "The contract," Eleanor said, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "Read it carefully." Lila's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Legal jargon swam before her eyes. Terms like gestational carrier, compensation, confidentiality. She wasn't stupid. She'd scraped by on street smarts and the occasional library book. But this was a labyrinth of words designed to trap the unwary. "You got a pen?" she asked, her tone defiant. Eleanor raised an eyebrow but handed her one. Lila scratched notes in the margins, circling clauses that made her gut twist. No contact with the child after birth. No public disclosure. Full medical oversight. It was a cage, gilded but still a cage. "You're thorough," Eleanor said, watching her with a mix of curiosity and impatience. Lila didn't look up. "I'm not signing my life away without knowing what I'm giving up." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she poured 2 glasses of wine, sliding one across the marble counter. Lila ignored it. She hadn't touched alcohol since her mom's boyfriend had shown her what it could do to a person's fists. The negotiations took hours. Lila pushed back on the no-contact clause, her voice sharp. "I'm not a machine. You can't just rent my body and expect me to forget what comes out of it." Eleanor's face softened, just for a moment. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said. "I'm asking you to trust me." Lila snorted. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the money, God, the money was a lifeline. She signed, her signature shaky but deliberate, and handed the contract back. "Don't make me regret this," she said. Eleanor arranged everything. A private clinic, a nutritionist, a small furnished apartment in Brooklyn for Lila to live in during the pregnancy. It was a far cry from the penthouse, but to Lila, it was a palace. Clean sheets, a fridge she could stock, a door that locked. The first night, she stood in the tiny kitchen, eating peanut butter straight from the jar, and cried. Not because she was sad, but because she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt safe. The insemination process was clinical, cold. Lila lay on the exam table, staring at the ceiling as the doctor explained the procedure. Eleanor was there, sitting in a corner, her hands clasped tightly. Their eyes met once, and Lila saw something raw in Eleanor's gaze. Hope, fear, maybe both. It was the first time Lila realized this wasn't just about money for Eleanor. This was personal. Weeks passed and the pregnancy took root. Lila's body changed, her hunger now a constant companion. Not just for food but for answers. Who was Eleanor, really? Why did she want this so badly? Late one night, unable to sleep, Lila Googled her. The results painted a picture of a woman who had it all. Art galleries across the country, a Forbes profile, a string of high-profile exes, all women. Eleanor was a lesbian, out and unapologetic, but the articles hinted at a private grief. A partner lost years ago in a car accident. Lila's chest tightened. She knew loss too. Her mom, her home, her sense of self. Maybe they weren't so different. Their meetings became routine. Checkups, ultrasounds, awkward small talk. Eleanor was always composed, her questions about Lila's health precise, almost detached. But Lila caught the way her eyes lingered on the ultrasound screen, the way her fingers twitched as if reaching for something she couldn't touch. "You ever think about what it'll be like?" Lila asked once, breaking the silence in the exam room. "Being a mom?" Eleanor's face closed off. "I've thought about it every day for 10 years, she said, and left it at that. Lila's life settled into a strange rhythm. She worked part-time at a bookstore, a job Eleanor's lawyer had arranged to keep her stable. She made friends with a coworker, a bubbly trans woman named Marisol who never asked about the pregnancy, but always brought Lila extra coffee. For the first time in years, Lila felt like she was building something, not just surviving. But the contract loomed over her, a reminder that this wasn't her life. It was borrowed. One evening, as Lila left the bookstore, she saw Eleanor waiting outside, leaning against her car. "We need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice softer than usual. Lila's stomach dropped. She'd been waiting for the other shoe to fall. "What now?" she asked, bracing herself. Eleanor hesitated, then opened the car door. "Get in. It's not about the contract." The city lights blurred as they drove, and Lila's heart pounded. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew one thing. Whatever Eleanor was about to say would change everything. Again. The car wound through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, past brownstones glowing with warm light. Lila's hands fidgeted in her lap, her thrift store sweater too tight over her growing belly. Eleanor drove in silence, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, she pulled into a small park, the kind with rusty swings and graffiti-covered benches. "Why here?" Lila asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Eleanor cut the engine and turned to her, eyes searching. "Because I need you to understand who I am," she said. "Not the version in the contract." Eleanor led her to a bench overlooking a frozen pond. The air was crisp, biting at Lila's cheeks, but Eleanor didn't seem to feel it. She sat, her posture perfect even on the splintered wood, and began to talk. "Her name was Claire," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "We were together for 7 years. We wanted a family." But then she trailed off, her gaze fixed on the pond. Lila didn't need the details. She'd seen enough grief to recognize it in the set of Eleanor's jaw, the way her hands clenched like they were holding onto a ghost. "She died 5 years ago," Eleanor continued. "A drunk driver. We'd been planning for a baby, but after, I didn't know how to move forward." Lila stayed quiet, her own losses echoing in the silence. Her mom's overdose, the foster homes, the streets. She wanted to snap that everyone had pain, that Eleanor's didn't make her special. But something in Eleanor's voice, raw, unguarded, stopped her. "I chose you because you're a survivor," Eleanor said, turning to meet Lila's eyes. "I need someone strong enough to carry this for me, for us." Lila's throat tightened. She wasn't used to being seen not like this. "You don't know me," she said, but the words lacked bite. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "I want to." The confession hung between them, fragile as frost. Lila didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't here to be Eleanor's friend, her confidant. She was here for the money, for the chance to claw her way out of the gutter. But the way Eleanor looked at her, like she was more than a means to an end, stirred something dangerous, something like hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of routine and unease. Lila's body grew heavier, the baby's kicks a constant reminder of the deal she'd made. She tried to keep Eleanor at arm's length, but the woman was relentless. She showed up at the bookstore with takeout, insisting Lila needed decent food. She sent texts checking in, her tone always formal but laced with something warmer. Lila hated how much she looked forward to those messages, how they made her feel less alone. One night, at a prenatal checkup, the doctor handed them an ultrasound image. The baby's profile was clear, a tiny nose, a curled fist. Lila's breath caught, and she glanced at Eleanor, expecting her usual composed smile. But Eleanor's eyes were wet, her hand trembling as she reached for the photo. "She's real," Eleanor whispered. And Lila realized she wasn't just talking to the doctor. She was talking to her. That moment cracked something open in Lila. She started noticing things. The way Eleanor's laugh softened when they talked about baby names. The way she'd linger after appointments like she didn't want to leave. Lila told herself it was nothing, that Eleanor was just invested in the baby. But late at night, alone in her apartment, she'd replay their conversations. The brush of Eleanor's hand when they passed the ultrasound photos. It was dangerous, this feeling. She was a surrogate, not a partner, not a lover. Marisol noticed the change. "You're glowing, but it's not just the baby," she teased over coffee at the bookstore. Lila rolled her eyes, but her cheeks burned. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. Marisol raised an eyebrow. "Girl, I know pining when I see it." Lila wanted to argue, but the words stuck. She didn't pine. She survived. And yet, Eleanor was becoming a part of her world in ways she hadn't expected. The tension came to a head at a charity gala Eleanor invited her to, insisting it was good for networking. Lila felt out of place in the borrowed dress, her belly straining against the fabric. The room glittered with wealth. Chandeliers, champagne, people who looked through her like she was invisible. But Eleanor didn't. She stayed close, introducing Lila as a friend, her hand brushing Lila's arm in a way that felt deliberate. When a drunk guest made a snide comment about Lila's situation, Eleanor's voice turned to ice. "She's carrying my future," she said, and the room went quiet. Lila's heart pounded as they left the gala, the city lights blurring around them. In the car, she turned to Eleanor. "Why'd you do that?" she asked. Eleanor's hands tightened on the wheel. "Because you're not just a contract to me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not anymore." The words were a spark in the dark, and Lila didn't know if she wanted to fan it into a flame or douse it before it burned them both. The air in Eleanor's penthouse was thick with unspoken words. Lila sat on the edge of a velvet couch, her hands resting on her swollen belly, now 6 months along. The gala had changed something, cracked the careful walls they'd both built. Eleanor paced, her heels clicking against the hardwood, a glass of wine untouched on the counter. "I shouldn't have said that," she said, her voice tight. In the car. It was unprofessional. Lila's chest ached. Unprofessional. That's what they were supposed to be. So why did it hurt? "I don't need your pity," Lila said, her tone sharper than she meant. "I'm here for the money, remember?" But her words felt hollow. She'd spent weeks telling herself this was just a job, but Eleanor's presence, her intensity, her care, was seeping into the cracks of her resolve. Lila stood, needing to move, to shake off the weight of Eleanor's gaze. "You don't get to make this complicated," she added, softer now. Eleanor stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto Lila's. "It's already complicated," she said. "You think I don't feel it? The way you look at me, the way I—" She cut herself off, running a hand through her hair. "I'm not supposed to want this." Lila's breath hitched. "Want what? The baby? Her? Both?" She didn't dare ask. Instead, she turned toward the window, the city sprawling below like a map of impossible choices. The next few weeks were a tightrope. Lila threw herself into her bookstore job, into late-night talks with Marisol, anything to keep her mind off Eleanor. But Eleanor was everywhere. Texts about doctor's appointments, care packages with prenatal vitamins and soft blankets. A handwritten note tucked into one that simply said, "Thank you for doing this." Lila kept the note under her pillow, hating herself for it. At the 7-month mark, a scare landed Lila in the hospital. A sharp pain had woken her in the middle of the night, and she'd called Eleanor in a panic, the only number she had memorized. Eleanor was there in under an hour, her face pale as she sat by Lila's bedside. The doctor assured them it was false labor, but Eleanor didn't leave. She stayed through the night, her hand inches from Lila's, close enough to feel the warmth but not crossing the line. "You didn't have to stay," Lila said the next morning, her voice hoarse. Eleanor's smile was tired but real. "Yes, I did. That was it, no explanations, no excuses. Just a truth that settled into Lila's bones. When they left the hospital, Eleanor drove her to Brooklyn, but instead of dropping her off, she parked. "Come up," Lila said before she could stop herself. "Just for coffee or something." The apartment was small, cluttered with books and second-hand furniture, but Eleanor didn't seem to notice. They sat at the tiny kitchen table, sipping coffee that tasted like burnt promises. "Tell me about you," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "Not the contract. You." Lila hesitated. She didn't talk about her past, too many sharp edges. But Eleanor's eyes were steady, waiting. So Lila told her. The mom who loved her until the drugs won, the foster homes that spit her out at 18, the streets that taught her to survive. Eleanor listened, her face unreadable but her eyes soft. When it was Eleanor's turn, she spoke of Claire again, of their dreams of a family, of the nursery they'd painted before the accident. "I thought I'd never feel that kind of hope again," she said, her voice breaking. "Until you." Lila's heart stopped. She wanted to run, to hide, but she was rooted to the chair. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't make this something it can't be." But it already was. The baby's kicks were a drumbeat between them, a reminder of the life they were creating, and the lines they couldn't cross. Eleanor reached across the table, her fingers brushing Lila's. "I'm trying not to," she said, "but I'm failing." The touch lingered, electric, and Lila didn't pull away. The next day, Lila found a package at her door. A journal, leather-bound, with a note from Eleanor. "Write your story. You're more than this moment." Lila traced the words, her throat tight. She didn't know how to be more, not yet. But for the first time, she wanted to try. As the pregnancy neared its end, the tension grew. Lila caught herself daydreaming. Not just about the money, but about a life where she and Eleanor could be something more. It was a dangerous thought, one the contract didn't allow. But every time Eleanor smiled, every time their hands brushed, the contract felt less like a cage and more like a challenge. Then came the call that shattered everything. Eleanor's lawyer, brisk and cold, informing Lila of a complication with the contract. A clause she'd overlooked, buried in fine print. If Lila developed an emotional attachment to the child, Eleanor could terminate the agreement and demand repayment. Lila's blood ran cold. She'd signed her name, but had she signed away her heart? Lila clutched the phone, the lawyer's words echoing like a gunshot. Emotional attachment. Repayment. She stared at the contract on her kitchen table, the pages now dog-eared and coffee-stained. She'd been careful, or so she thought, keeping her heart locked away, focusing on the money, the future. But the baby's kicks, Eleanor's lingering touches, the journal under her pillow, they'd woven a thread she couldn't untangle. She was attached, not just to the child growing inside her, but to the woman who'd made this possible. And now it could cost her everything. She didn't call Eleanor. Instead, she walked. The Brooklyn streets were alive with late winter slush, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Lila's breath fogged as she moved, her mind racing. The contract was clear. If Eleanor deemed her too involved, she'd lose the money, the apartment, the fragile stability she'd built. Worse, she'd lose the baby, and maybe Eleanor too. The thought twisted like a knife. She hadn't meant to care this much. At the bookstore, Marisol noticed her silence. "Spill it," she said, sliding a muffin across the counter. Lila shook her head, but Marisol's eyes were relentless. "It's her, isn't it? The fancy lady." Lila's laugh was brittle. "It's everything," she admitted, and the story poured out. The contract, the clause, the feelings she couldn't name. Marisol listened, then leaned back. "You're in love with her," she said, not a question. Lila's face burned. "I'm not. It's not like that." But Marisol's smile was knowing. "Sure, hon. Keep telling yourself that." Lila avoided Eleanor for days, ignoring texts, skipping a checkup. She needed space to think, to rebuild the walls she'd let crumble. But Eleanor wasn't one to be ignored. On the fourth day, she showed up at the bookstore, her coat dusted with snow, her face a mix of worry and frustration. "You can't just disappear," she said, her voice low to avoid the curious stares of customers. "Not now." Not when we're so close. I'm not your property, Lila snapped, her hands shaking as she stacked books. Eleanor's eyes softened. I know, she said. But I'm scared, Lila. For you. For the baby. For us. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lila wanted to scream, to demand what us even meant, but the store wasn't the place. Meet me tonight, she said instead. My place. We need to talk. That evening, the apartment felt too small for the conversation ahead. Eleanor arrived with takeout, a peace offering, but Lila couldn't eat. She held up the contract, pointing to the clause. Did you know about this? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside. Eleanor's face fell. I didn't write it, she said. My lawyer, it's standard, to protect the intended parent. Lila laughed, sharp and humorless. Protect you. From me. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice urgent. I don't want protection from you. I want. She stopped, her hands clenching. I want you to be part of this. Not just the pregnancy. After. Lila's heart stuttered. After? She echoed. Eleanor nodded, her eyes searching Lila's. I know it's not in the contract. I know it's messy. But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. The confession was a spark in a powder keg. Lila wanted to believe it, to lean into the warmth of Eleanor's words, but fear held her back. You don't get it, she said, her voice breaking. I'm not like you. I don't have money, power, a safety net. If this goes wrong, I lose everything. Eleanor's face crumpled, and for the first time, Lila saw her not as the untouchable heiress but as a woman just as scared as she was. They talked until midnight, laying bare their fears, their hopes. Eleanor admitted she'd been running from her grief, using the baby as a way to fill the void Claire left. Lila confessed her own scars, the way survival had taught her to distrust kindness. By the end, they were sitting on the floor, takeout containers forgotten, their hands inches apart. What do we do now? Lila asked, her voice barely audible. We rewrite the rules, Eleanor said. Together. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was enough to keep Lila from running. They agreed to meet with the lawyer to renegotiate the contract. But as Eleanor left, her hand brushing Lila's in a fleeting, deliberate touch, Lila knew the real risk wasn't the contract. It was her heart. The next week, at the lawyer's office, Eleanor fought for changes, removing the no-contact clause, ensuring Lila's financial security regardless of emotional attachment. The lawyer warned it was unconventional, risky. Eleanor didn't care. She's not just a surrogate, she said, her voice firm. She's family. Lila's breath caught, but she didn't contradict her. Not this time. As they left the office, snow falling softly around them, Lila felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of the life tying them together. She glanced at Eleanor, whose smile was small but real. For the first time, Lila let herself imagine a future. Not just for the baby, but for them. The 8th month brought a quiet intensity, like the calm before a storm. Lila's body was a map of changes. Stretch marks, swollen ankles, a heaviness that made every step deliberate. She'd grown used to the baby's rhythms, the kicks that woke her at dawn, the way her heart raced at every ultrasound. But it was Eleanor's presence that anchored her now, a constant she hadn't expected. They were rewriting the rules, yes, but the boundaries between them were blurring, and Lila didn't know where they'd land. Eleanor insisted on weekly dinners, claiming it was for bonding. Lila saw through the excuse but showed up anyway, her thrift store dresses swapped for maternity clothes Eleanor had sent. The penthouse dinners were awkward at first. Lila felt like an imposter, her fork hesitant over plates of food she couldn't pronounce. But Eleanor's stories, her dry humor, the way she listened when Lila talked about her dreams of writing, they chipped away at the distance. One night, over roasted duck and candlelight, Eleanor asked, "What's the first thing you'll do with the money? After the baby?" Lila paused, her fork hovering. She hadn't let herself think that far. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe take a writing class. Or just live without looking over my shoulder." Eleanor's smile was soft, almost proud. "You'll do more than live," she said. "You'll thrive." The words felt like a promise, one Lila wanted to believe. But the world outside their bubble wasn't so kind. Gossip blogs had caught wind of Eleanor's mysterious pregnant friend, splashing blurry photos of them leaving the hospital. The headlines were vicious. "Millionaire's secret surrogate? Who's the homeless girl in Grayson's life?" Lila's stomach churned as she read them, her past laid bare for strangers to dissect. She'd been nobody for so long, and now she was a spectacle. Marisol tried to cheer her up, joking about her fame. But Lila felt exposed, raw. Eleanor was furious. She hired a PR team to squash the stories, but the damage was done. At their next dinner, she reached for Lila's hand across the table. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick. "I should have protected you better." Lila pulled her hand away, not because she was angry, but because the touch made her want too much. "It's not your job to protect me," she said. "I'm not fragile." But she felt fragile, especially when the contractions started. They were mild at first, practice runs for the real thing, but they scared her. She called Eleanor, who arrived at the apartment with a bag of groceries and a calm that steadied Lila's nerves. They spent the night watching old movies, Eleanor's laughter filling the small space. When Lila winced through a contraction, Eleanor's hand found hers. And this time, Lila didn't pull away. The next morning, they went to the hospital for a checkup. The doctor warned that labor could come early, and Lila's fear spiked. She wasn't ready. Not for the birth, not for the aftermath, not for the moment she'd have to hand over the baby. Eleanor seemed to sense it. In the car, she turned to Lila. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "Whatever happens, I'm here." Lila wanted to believe her, but the contract, the gossip, the weight of their differences, it all loomed like a shadow. That night, Lila wrote in the journal Eleanor had given her. She poured out her fears, her hopes, her confusion about the woman who was both her employer and something more. "I don't know what we are," she wrote, "but I know I don't want to lose her." She didn't show Eleanor the journal, but the act of writing felt like a release, a way to hold on to herself. The media storm grew worse. A tabloid published Lila's juvenile record, petty theft from her teen years, when hunger had driven her to desperation. Eleanor's lawyer called, warning that the scrutiny could jeopardize the contract's legality. "They're saying you're unstable," he said. Lila's blood boiled. Unstable. As if surviving the streets wasn't proof of strength. Eleanor shut the lawyer down, her voice sharp. "She's the strongest person I know," she said, and Lila's heart ached with something she didn't want to name. As the due date approached, they made a plan. Lila would stay at Eleanor's penthouse for the final weeks, where they could avoid the paparazzi. The move felt like crossing a threshold. Lila's things, her books, her journal, looked out of place among Eleanor's sleek decor, but Eleanor made space for them, for her. They cooked together, laughed together, and when Lila woke from nightmares about losing the baby, Eleanor was there, her voice a quiet anchor in the dark. One night, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Lila asked the question she'd been avoiding. "What happens after the baby's born? To us?" Eleanor's face was unreadable in the moonlight. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want there to be an us." The words were a lifeline, but Lila knew the real test was coming. The baby would change everything, for better or for worse. The penthouse was a cocoon, shielding Lila from the world's prying eyes. At 8.5 months, her body felt like a stranger's. Heavy, aching, alive with the baby's constant movement. Eleanor was a steady presence, her efficiency softened by small gestures. A cup of tea left on the counter, a playlist of soft jazz to calm Lila's nerves. But the weight of the approaching birth pressed down on them both, a ticking clock neither could ignore. Lila spent her days reading, writing in her journal, trying to make sense of the life she was building. She'd started sketching 2 rough drawings of the city, of Eleanor's profile as she worked at her desk. It was a way to hold onto this moment, to keep it from slipping away. Eleanor caught her sketching once, her smile shy. "You're good," she said, and Lila blushed, muttering something about it being just a hobby. But Eleanor framed one of the sketches, a view of Central Park from the penthouse, and hung it in the living room. Lila couldn't look at it without her chest tightening. The media hadn't let up. Paparazzi camped outside the building, their cameras flashing whenever Lila stepped onto the balcony. Eleanor's PR team worked overtime, but the headlines grew uglier. Grayson's surrogate scandal. Homeless girl exploiting millionaire? Lila tried to ignore them, but each word was a cut, reminding her of the gap between her world and Eleanor's. She wasn't just carrying a baby. She was carrying the weight of public judgment. One evening, Eleanor came home with a stack of legal documents. "I'm revising the contract again," she said, spreading the papers on the dining table. "No more clauses about emotional attachment. And I'm setting up a trust for you, separate from the payment." Lila's throat closed. "Why?" she asked, her voice rough. Eleanor met her eyes. "Because you deserve a future, no matter what happens with us." The word "us" hung there, fragile and full of possibility. They were interrupted by a call from the hospital. Lila's blood pressure was spiking, a risk for preeclampsia. The doctor wanted her in for monitoring, possibly induction if things worsened. Panic clawed at Lila's chest as they drove to the hospital, Eleanor's hand steady on hers. "You're going to be okay," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Both of you." Lila wanted to believe her, but fear was louder than promises. The hospital was a blur of white walls and beeping machines. Lila lay in a bed, hooked to monitors, while Eleanor paced, her composure fraying. The doctor confirmed the need for induction. Labor would start soon, ready or not. Lila's mind spun. She wasn't ready to let go. Not of the baby. Not of the strange, beautiful thing she and Eleanor had built. When the nurse left, Eleanor sat beside her, her hand finding Lila's. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and Lila nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Labor came fast, a tidal wave of pain and fear. Lila gripped Eleanor's hand, her breaths ragged, as the contractions tore through her. Eleanor stayed, whispering encouragement, her voice a lifeline through the chaos. "You're so strong," she said, over and over, until Lila almost believed it. Hours blurred into a haze of effort and exhaustion, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her body and Eleanor's presence. When the baby's cry pierced the air, Lila's heart cracked open. The nurse placed the tiny girl, pink, squirming, perfect, in her arms, and Lila sobbed, overwhelmed by a love she hadn't expected. She looked at Eleanor, expecting joy, but Eleanor's face was a storm of emotions. Relief, fear, something deeper. "Do you want to hold her?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, tears streaming down her face as she took the baby. The moment Eleanor held her daughter, something shifted. Her eyes locked onto Lila's, and in that shared gaze, they both knew. This wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about them, about the family they hadn't planned but couldn't deny. The nurse bustled in, breaking the moment, but Lila felt it. The spark of a new beginning, fragile but real. They named her Ava, after Eleanor's grandmother. Lila stayed in the hospital for 2 days, Ava's tiny weight a constant in her arms. Eleanor was there every moment, sleeping in a chair, her hand never far from Lila's. But the contract still loomed, a shadow over their fragile joy. Lila knew the payment was coming, the end of their deal. What would happen when the money changed hands? Would Eleanor still look at her the same way? On the day of discharge, Eleanor drove them to the penthouse. Ava slept in a car seat, her tiny breaths filling the silence. Lila stared out the window, her heart a tangle of love and fear. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Eleanor's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "We figure it out," she said. "Together." The penthouse felt different with Ava in it. Her tiny cries echoed off the marble, softening the edges of Eleanor's pristine world. Lila sat on the couch, Ava nestled against her chest, her warmth a reminder of the life they'd created. Eleanor moved carefully, like she was afraid to break something. Ava, Lila, or maybe herself. The contract's final payment was wired to Lila's account that morning, $150,000, a fortune she could barely comprehend. But the money felt distant, irrelevant, compared to the weight of Ava's breath against her skin. Eleanor watched them from the kitchen, her hands busy with bottles and formula, but her eyes kept drifting to Lila. "You're good with her," she said, her voice soft. Lila's chest tightened. She wasn't supposed to be good with her. She was supposed to hand Ava over and walk away. That was the deal. But every time Ava's tiny hand curled around her finger, the contract felt like a lie. The first week was a blur of sleepless nights and tentative moments. Lila stayed in the guest room, her belongings still in boxes, a reminder that this wasn't permanent. Eleanor insisted she stay, citing the paparazzi and Lila's recovery. But Lila knew it was more than that. They were tiptoeing around the truth. Neither wanted to let go. They took turns feeding Ava, changing her, marveling at her tiny features. In those quiet moments, Lila caught glimpses of a life she'd never dared imagine. A family, a home. But the world outside wouldn't let them forget. A tabloid published a photo of Lila leaving the hospital, Ava in her arms, with a headline screaming, "Surrogate refuses to give up baby." Eleanor's lawyer called, warning of potential lawsuits from concerned parties. Investors, family members, anyone who saw Lila as a threat to Eleanor's empire. Lila overheard the call, her stomach churning. "I'm not refusing anything," she told Eleanor, her voice sharp. "I'm just here." Eleanor's face was a mask of guilt. "I know," she said, "but they don't understand. They think you're—" She stopped, but Lila knew the rest. A gold digger, a liability. She'd been called worse on the streets, but it stung coming from Eleanor's world. "Let them think what they want," Lila said, cradling Ava. "I'm not leaving her. Not yet." The tension grew as Ava's first month passed. Eleanor's board of directors pressured her to resolve the situation, their coded way of saying Lila needed to go. Eleanor fought back, her voice sharp in late-night calls, but Lila saw the toll it took. One night, after Ava was asleep, Eleanor poured 2 glasses of wine and sat across from Lila. "I need to know what you want," she said, her voice raw. "Because I'm fighting for you, but I don't know if you want to be fought for." Lila's heart pounded. She wanted to say everything. To admit she loved Ava, loved Eleanor, loved the life they were stumbling into. But fear stopped her. "I want to be more than a contract," she said finally, her voice breaking. "But I don't know how." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she reached for Lila's hand. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, echoing her words from the hospital. "But you have to stay." Lila stayed. They fell into a rhythm, a fragile domesticity that felt like a dream. Lila wrote in her journal, pages filled with Ava's milestones and her own tangled feelings. Eleanor started leaving work early, her laughter filling the penthouse as she played with Ava. They shared meals, stories, quiet moments that felt like promises. But the outside world kept pressing in. A letter arrived from Eleanor's estranged sister, demanding a meeting about the child's future. Lila's name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was clear. She was the problem. The meeting was set for a week later. Eleanor prepared like she was going to war, her lawyer drafting statements, her PR team crafting a narrative. Lila felt like a bystander in her own life. She spent hours with Ava, memorizing her face, her smell, knowing it could all be taken away. The night before the meeting, she found Eleanor on the balcony, staring at the city. "I won't let them take her from you," Eleanor said, her voice fierce. "Or you from me." Lila's breath caught. She stepped closer, their shoulders brushing. "And if they try?" she asked. Eleanor turned, her eyes blazing. "They'll have to go through me." For the first time, Lila believed her. They stood there, the city humming below, Ava sleeping inside, and Lila let herself hope. For Ava, for Eleanor, for a future they could build together. The boardroom was a battlefield of glass and steel. Lila sat at one end of the long table, Ava in a carrier beside her, her tiny gurgles the only sound cutting through the tension. Eleanor stood at the head, her tailored suit a stark contrast to Lila's jeans and sweater. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, sat across from them, her face a mask of disdain. The lawyer, a man with a voice like gravel, outlined the concerns. Lila's background, her influence on Eleanor, the potential scandal. Lila's hands clenched under the table, but she kept her eyes on Ava, grounding herself in the baby's steady breaths. Margaret spoke first, her voice clipped. This arrangement was supposed to be simple, Eleanor. A surrogate, not a partner. The word stung, but Lila didn't flinch. Eleanor's response was ice cold. Lila is Ava's mother as much as I am. This isn't just about the contract anymore. The room went silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Lila's heart raced. Mother. It was the first time Eleanor had said it, and it felt like a claim, a promise. The lawyer tried to steer the conversation back to legalities, but Margaret wasn't done. You're risking everything, she said, her eyes flicking to Lila. Your reputation, your business, for her. Lila wanted to snap back, to defend herself, but Eleanor beat her to it. I'm not risking anything, she said, her voice steady. I'm choosing my family. The word hung in the air, and Lila felt Ava's warmth against her leg, anchoring her. The meeting ended with no resolution, just a tense agreement to revisit the issue. But Lila knew it wasn't over. Margaret's parting glance was a warning, and the lawyer's notes were a blueprint for trouble. As they left, Eleanor's hand found Lila's, squeezing tightly. I meant it, she said. Your family. Lila nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Back at the penthouse, they fell into their routine, but the shadow of the meeting lingered. Lila wrote in her journal, pages filled with fear and defiance. I'm not just a surrogate. I'm Ava's mom. And maybe, just maybe, I'm Eleanor something. She didn't show Eleanor the words, but she didn't need to. Eleanor's actions spoke louder. Her fierce protection, her quiet moments rocking Ava. The way she looked at Lila like she was the answer to a question she'd been asking for years. The media frenzy intensified. A talk show host speculated about Eleanor's unstable choices, and a blog posted Lila's mugshot from years ago, painting her as a criminal. Lila stopped reading the headlines, but the weight of judgment followed her. She started taking Ava for walks in Central Park, hoping the open air would clear her head. One day, a woman approached her. Not a reporter, but a fan of Eleanor's galleries. You're the one she chose, she said, her voice kind. Don't let them make you feel small. Lila blinked back tears, nodding. It was a reminder that not everyone saw her as a scandal. Eleanor began opening up about her past, sharing stories of Claire, of her dreams for Ava. Lila listened, her own walls crumbling. She told Eleanor about her mom's laugh, her love of poetry, the way she'd read to Lila before the drugs took over. They were building something piece by piece, a foundation stronger than any contract. But the outside world kept knocking. Margaret sent a letter, demanding a DNA test to confirm Ava's parentage, a thinly veiled attack on Lila's role. Eleanor tore it up, but Lila saw the worry in her eyes. One night, as Ava slept, Lila found Eleanor in the nursery, staring at the crib. What if I can't protect you both? Eleanor whispered. Lila stepped closer, her hand resting on Eleanor's arm. You already are, she said. But I'm not helpless. We do this together. Eleanor turned, her eyes searching Lila's, and for a moment, the world fell away. They were inches apart, the air charged with everything unsaid. Then Ava's cry broke the spell, and they both laughed, the tension easing. As Ava's first birthday approached, Lila and Eleanor planned a quiet celebration. Just them, Marisol, and a small cake. But the night before, Margaret showed up unannounced, her face a storm. This ends now, she said, holding a court order. You're not fit to be near that child. The words were aimed at Lila, but they cut Eleanor just as deep. The battle for their family was far from over, and Lila knew the hardest fight was yet to come. Margaret's court order was a grenade, shattering the fragile peace Lila and Eleanor had built. It demanded a custody evaluation, citing Lila's unstable background as a risk to Ava. Lila stood frozen in the penthouse doorway, Ava in her arms, as Eleanor read the document. her face pale but resolute. "This isn't happening," Eleanor said, her voice steel. "She's our daughter." Lila's heart swelled at the hour, but fear gnawed at her. She'd fought to survive the streets, but this was a different kind of war. One fought with lawyers and money, not grit. The next weeks were a whirlwind. Eleanor hired the best family law attorney in New York, a woman named Carla who spoke with the precision of a surgeon. Carla laid out their options: fight the court order, prove Lila's stability, and redefine the custody agreement to include her as a co-parent. It was a long shot, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. "We're not losing her," she told Lila, her eyes fierce. Lila nodded, clutching Ava's tiny hand, but doubt lingered. She wasn't Eleanor's equal, not in the eyes of the world. The media smelled blood. Headlines screamed about the custody battle and Eleanor Grayson's reckless choices. Lila's past was dissected. Every mistake, every moment of desperation. She stopped leaving the penthouse, afraid of the cameras, the whispers. But Eleanor wouldn't let her hide. She brought in a therapist to help Lila process the scrutiny, a tutor to prepare her for a GED she hadn't thought she'd ever need. "You're not just Ava's mom," Eleanor said one night, as they sat with takeout and a sleeping baby. "You're someone. Don't let them forget that." The court date loomed, a storm on the horizon. Lila wrote furiously in her journal, pages filled with love for Ava, fear of losing her, and something deeper for Eleanor. She hadn't said the words, "I love you," but they were there, in every glance, every touch. Eleanor felt it too. Lila knew, but they hadn't crossed that line, not with Ava's future hanging in the balance. They were a team, a family, but the world wasn't ready to see it. The hearing was held in a sterile courtroom, the judge's face unreadable. Margaret sat with her lawyer, her expression smug. Carla presented their case. Lila's transformation, her bond with Ava, Eleanor's unwavering commitment. Lila took the stand, her voice shaking but clear. "I was homeless, yes," she said, "but that doesn't make me less of a mother. Ava's my heart, and Eleanor's my home." The words slipped out, raw and true, and she saw Eleanor's eyes glisten from the gallery. Margaret's lawyer painted Lila as an opportunist, a risk. But Carla countered with letters from Marisol, the bookstore owner, even the hospital staff, all testifying to Lila's strength, her love. The judge listened, her pen tapping, and Lila held her breath. When Eleanor took the stand, she spoke with a fire Lila hadn't seen before. "Lila gave me more than a child," she said. "She gave me a reason to believe in love again. We're a family, and we'll fight for it." The judge's ruling came a week later, joint custody, with Lila recognized as a co-parent. Margaret's claims were dismissed, her influence diminished. Lila cried when she heard, her arms around Eleanor, Ava babbling between them. The victory was theirs, but it was hard-won, a testament to the battles they'd fought together. They celebrated Ava's first birthday in the penthouse, balloons and laughter filling the space. Marisol brought a cake, her grin wide as she hugged Lila. "Told you were pining," she whispered, and Lila laughed, her heart full. After the guests left, Lila and Eleanor sat with Ava, the city lights sparkling outside. "I love you," Lila said, the words finally free. Eleanor's smile was radiant. "I love you too," she said, and they kissed, soft and sure, Ava's tiny hand resting on theirs. The future wasn't perfect. The media still watched, and Margaret's shadow lingered. But Lila had her GED, a writing class, a family. She kept her journal, now filled with stories of hope, of Ava's first steps, of Eleanor's laughter. They were rewriting their story, not as a contract but as a promise. A love that defied the odds, a family built on trust. When Lila held Ava, she felt the weight of everything they'd overcome. And when she looked at Eleanor, she saw not just a rich woman or a savior, but her partner, her equal. The world had tried to tear them apart, but they'd held on. Together, they were unstoppable.